Well, thanks very much for coming. This is sort of an awkward moment for me. This is my first night out on the road, and with my previous books, when I do a program like this, I always like to kind of start with a funny story. And with Charles Manson, that's really impossible. I've met with people from every stage of Manson's life. Nobody wanted to pull me aside and tell me about some cute thing he did as a child or some wonderful thing, generous thing he did as an adult. The only story that I can share with you that might be remotely humorous, I heard in McMecken, West Virginia, the little West Virginia, Ohio River factory town where Manson lived twice. First as a very young boy with his uncle and aunt and cousin, and then later when he was out of reform school for a couple of years. And McMecken is a very small town where everybody knows everybody else, and there are 75 and 80-year-olds still living there who remember him pretty well, even though they'd never talked before. And in one case, I found one of the loveliest ladies you will ever come across, 80 years old. Her name was Virginia Bradigan. She and Charles Manson got to be friends in the Nazarene Church youth group that Manson's grandmother insisted he join. And they even, as Virginia modestly said, sparked a while. And I couldn't help asking, what is it like to go on a date with Charles Manson? And she, well, we never would have formal dates in those days, we'd just gather at somebody's house and would bob for apples or something like that. And she said, but I don't think he was really a bad boy, but he was kind of fresh. And I said, oh, what did Manson do that was fresh? And she said, on our third night out, he asked if he could kiss me goodnight. And he did, but he tried to use his tongue. And that is about as funny as the Charles Manson story gets. Writing a book about Manson was different, obviously, than any of the other 15 I've written. What I do in my nonfiction is I try to pick an era in American history that I want to write about, and then I try to choose an iconic individual or event something that became so well known during that time, and tell a story with context for a change. I always think there's no sense in writing a nonfiction book unless you break new ground. You don't want to tell the same story that's been told over and over. And I have always believed and always found that when it comes to history, the truth is more fascinating than the mythology. There have been, by my count, just over 200 books published about Charles Manson. And the obvious question is, well, why write another one? I wrote this book because nobody had yet produced the one I wanted to read. It was as though in these books Charles Manson emerges full-fledged in Los Angeles in the late 60s, somehow gets a group of apparently crazy people to follow him, and murder results. I wanted to know more about Manson's whole life. How did he get to where he was? And no one had written that book. They had always taken Manson's word for quite a few things, that he was the illegitimate son of a teenage prostitute, that his mother once tried to sell him for a pitcher of beer, that his mother didn't want him and basically threw him out into a series of cruel reform schools where he was abused. Almost all these things turn out not to be true. And following his path was mesmerizing. It wasn't always fun, and I can't tell you that I have come away with admiration for him. My first and strongest conclusion, though, is this: that Charles Mills Manson is not now and was never crazy, never insane. In every way, he was a very bright man who took advantage of things in our culture and in his life that were meant to be positive and turned them to his own ends. The things that we saw and heard about that happened in Los Angeles in August of 1969 followed a pattern that Manson had kept from childhood. By finding his sister, by finding his cousin, by finding the kids he grew up with, the people who shared his cell in prisons, the people who joined the Manson family for a little while, were appalled and left, and the people who stayed right to the bitter, bloody end, including Patricia Krenwinkel, who'd never really given a full, detailed explanation of the Tate LaBianca murders before. We get his whole life, and it's there, and it's documented. I've never written a book that had more new material in it. And I hope if you read the book, you'll pay careful attention to the notes, so if you wonder where I found something out, you can see exactly. The most surprising interview I had with anybody over the 3 years it took to research and write this book was Manson's cousin Joanne. I asked Joanne, how did you feel when you read in the newspaper that your cousin had been arrested for these notorious murders in California? And she said, well, I wasn't surprised because I know Charles so well. My only question was, what took him this long? From her and from other people who grew up with Manson, I heard this story. It is true that when Charles Manson started first grade in McMecken, he was living with his uncle and aunt and cousin because his mother was in prison, not for prostitution, but for the most egregiously botched armed robbery attempt in maybe the annals of West Virginia crime. She and her brother tried to hold up a man by poking him in the back with a Coke bottle and telling him it was a gun. Except it wasn't a Coke bottle, as originally reported, it was an empty ketchup bottle. And when he got through laughing, the man got in touch with the police, they were arrested, and Manson's mother and uncle were then ridiculed as the ketchup bottle robbers. Charlie, 5 years old, comes to McMecken to live with Uncle Bill and Aunt Glenna and cousin Joanne. First day of school, a teacher picks on him, and he runs back to their house crying. McMecken is the kind of community where boys don't do that. And Uncle Bill decided he was going to teach this kid a lesson, and on the second day of school, he took one of Joanne's dresses out of the closet, put it on Charlie, and made him wear it to school. Yes, that part did happen, and it was an awful thing to do to a child. The part of the story we don't hear is that a week later, Manson talked some of the girls in his first grade class into beating up a boy that he didn't like. And when he was taken to the principal's office, his defense was the girls were just doing what they wanted to do. It wasn't his responsibility. You may recognize that as the same defense he offered for the Tate LaBianca murders 30 years later. He made his first violent attack on someone at age 7 when he took a razor-sharp sickle and tried to kill his cousin Joanne. When his mother got out of prison, she did not try to get rid of her son. She loved him dearly, but he was a chronic cutter of school. She got a job as a grocery store clerk, and Charlie would come in and shoplift. He would hustle money from customers at the store. Even as a 10-year-old, he was increasingly violent. And after counseling with her mother, with her sister, with the teachers, it was decided Charlie probably should be in some boys' school where there would be a little more discipline enforced and rules for him to follow. Charlie in a very open school environment, the first place that he went, immediately began running away, committing different criminal acts. The picture on the cover of the book, Charlie's 13 years old there. He's just been picked up for armed robbery and is coming before a judge that day in Indiana. Charlie, who was technically a member of the Church of the Nazarene, convinced the judge that he was a Catholic and that the judge should send him to Boys Town rather than a reformatory. Charlie went to Boys Town. 3 days later, he stole a priest's car and headed for the West Coast. They caught him somewhere in Utah. He wasn't changing ever. He did not evolve into something. This is who he was. And every time he was released from prison, he went back to it. One of the shocking things in the book, if you look at the photo section, you will see there's some photographs of Manson that have never been published anywhere, particularly childhood. I got these pictures from his sister and aunt, taken directly from their family photo albums. Only one time did Charles Manson try to live a straight life. He comes back to McMecken to live with his grandmother after years and years in reform school, and he meets and marries a girl named Rosalie Willis. And after they got married, Charlie tried to take a straight job. He worked at a racetrack, taking care of the animals. He got part-time jobs in a grocery store. Money was tight, but for a little while he tried. We've got people who remember him taking them to their Little League baseball practices when he borrowed a car, doing little things like fixing a neighbor's stoop, but it didn't last long. And he turned to car theft, took stolen cars across the state line, got arrested in California. Things went downhill from there. But we have his wedding picture. Remember, he says that nobody in his family ever wanted him. The wedding picture is taken in the parlor of his grandmother's house. She gave them a big wedding, complete with an expensive cake. And the picture that I wanted to put on the cover, but my publisher and my distinguished editor chose otherwise, was Charlie cutting into the cake with a huge knife. I thought it was kind of symbolic, but Simon & Schuster didn't agree. So you'll just have to take a look at the picture inside instead. Some of the harder parts of the book were interviewing the folks in Los Angeles who were involved with Tate LaBianca. Have most of you read Vincent Bugliosi's wonderful Helter Skelter? I do want to say how grateful I am to Vince. He could not have been more generous when I was writing this book. He was very helpful. He put me in touch with various people and was willing to be surprised by some of the things in the book that caught him off guard. He had bought into Manson's childhood tales, for instance, and was surprised to learn they weren't true. But perhaps the strangest interview I had was with Patricia Krenwinkel at the California Institute for Women. It's very tough to get to be a visitor there anyway, and they're very concerned having anyone meet with the so-called Manson killers. They fear that someone will try to attack them for the notoriety they would get for it. Patricia Krenwinkel now is a wizened old woman. She is in her late 60s. She looks like she could be 85 or 90. A life in prison will do that to you. She, in an attempt to somewhat atone for the things that she did with Manson, she now trains rescue dogs to be guide dogs for the blind. That's her job, and she has done it so far with 9 different dogs. I wondered whether Patricia Krenwinkel would speak to me honestly. She said she would answer any questions I asked her, and it turned out that she did. And as she walked me through the events of those 2 nights, first the Tate killings and the next night the LaBianca nights, she was very graphic. In the process, she answered some questions that still remained for the LAPD, who immediately afterward wanted to subpoena my notes. They were surprised to learn that I hadn't been allowed to take a notebook in, They're very careful. They wouldn't even let you bring recording devices in, so that I would have to go back to the motel and type them into my computer. Krenwinkel told me, among other things, that I had not known. And nobody, I think, knew this. There's a definite reason that the first night one person lived. William Garretson, the teenage caretaker who was living in a guest cottage behind the main house. As Patricia tells the story, she had chased Abigail Folger out onto the lawn, tackled her, and began to stab her. And she talked about how sometimes as she stabbed, she would hit bone and how that hurt her hand. And Tex Watson is killing someone just a few feet away, also out in the lawn. She thinks she's killed Abigail Folger, but she's not sure, and she calls Tex over and says, "I'm not sure she's dead." Tex said, "I'll finish her for sure. You go kill who's ever in the little house in the back." Krenwinkel, covered with blood, half sickened by what she's been doing, starts walking in the path behind the house towards the guest cottage, and she's overcome by a dizzy spell. So she just leans back against the wall out of Watson's sight. A couple minutes later, comes back and says to him, "I looked in the window, there's nobody there." That's why William Garretson lived. They come back to Spahn Ranch. Manson is waiting for them. And one by one he interrogates them. Not just did they kill people, how much money did they get? He's very upset that they only had about $80 in cash that they'd taken. But what's most important to him, what he keeps haranguing them about, how did you leave the bodies? Did you make it look dramatic? Are they going to think that the Panthers did this? He's not satisfied with the answers. He gets in the car that they had been driving in, goes back by himself, and rearranges things at the murder site. I said to Pat, how do you know for sure he did that? She said during the trial, when they brought out the photographs of the death scene that the cops saw, she said, Leslie and Susan and I couldn't believe it. We were saying, well, no, that chair wasn't there. There was a big American flag that they found draped over the couch, and then Sharon Tate's bloody body next to the couch. The flag had been hanging on a corner of a closet in another room. And Manson obviously got the flag and brought it out, trying to make sort of a more dramatic statement. I did not see Charles Manson in person. For a period of 4.5, 5 months, I sent him a letter a day asking for an interview. He finally wrote me back. It was not a pleasant letter, and he certainly made it clear that he didn't want me writing this book. Later, however, he did give me written permission to use some of his prison artwork in the photo section. Manson still has a number of active followers today. There's a lot of folks out there. In fact, sometimes people have camped outside the prisons where he's held, hoping that somehow the prison doors will open and he will come out to lead them. And Manson has very thoughtfully passed my home address, phone number, and email along to some of these people. And I've been hearing from them. In fact, one of them said he would be seeing me tonight here at the Strand, and I'm just curious. Oh, well. So it's going to be interesting. I am sending Manson a copy of the book. I don't think he will like it. It certainly points out all the things that he lied about. Above all, let me stress this again. He is not crazy. This is a smart man, a manipulative sociopath who cobbled together all kinds of things and used them to his own advantage. Maybe some of you have by now heard the Dale Carnegie story, which seems to be what the media is really picking up on about this book. I went to Nashville, Tennessee, and found Phil Kaufman, an old prison mate at Charlie's who later got in the music business as a roadie, and is most famous when his buddy Graham Parsons, the musician, died, of stealing Parsons' body and taking it to Joshua Tree Monument to burn it, because that's what Parsons had said he always wanted. Anyway, Kaufman, who's now 76 years old, a big, huge guy with a gray handlebar mustache who came to our lunch riding the biggest Harley I'd ever seen in my life, I said, Phil, I got to know, all I hear from people is how when they met Charlie Manson, it was like he looked into their soul and he started talking about what they wanted to talk about, that he just had this amazing knack for winning people over right away. I mean, was it something mystic? Did you see this? And Kaufman laughed so hard and slammed his fist down on the table, and my iced tea spilled everywhere. And Kaufman said, I've been waiting almost 50 years for somebody to ask me that question. And I said, well, answer it. And Kaufman said, in prison, Charlie signed up for the Dale Carnegie course. The prison was trying to teach inmates how to function better on the outside. And he would come back to the cell and practice the lines that he'd learned in class that day, not because he wanted to make friends and influence people, but because he wanted to be a pimp when he got out. And he was going to use these lines to try to recruit girls for his string. And I said, so you're telling me that Dale Carnegie was sort of Charles Manson's guru? And he said, you damn betcha. And so I sent off, I got copies of the classroom materials that they would use in McNeil Prison back in those days, and was reading the book. Then I go out to Corona to interview Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel, and I asked them both separately, because you can only talk to one at a time, what did Charles Manson say to you when you first met him that made you want to follow him? And they said, well, Charlie said this, this, this. Word for word out of chapter 7. In How to Win Friends and Influence People. He also cobbled in some Scientology, some Beatles music, the Book of Revelation. Dr. David Smith, who founded the Free Clinic in Haight-Ashbury, told me he got to know Charles Manson well. That Manson would follow around the other street gurus. He would crib their most effective lines. He would come into the Free Clinic and practice his preaching on the sick hippies. And when he finally got it all down and made it sound natural, he would go back to Golden Gate Park and find young girls to preach to. So while he was a great cribber of other people's work, a lot of the things that Manson had to say were not original. I don't think that the Dale Carnegie people are happy with this revelation. I had actually suggested to my editor, because Simon & Schuster also publishes Dale Carnegie stuff, they should make use of this. And, you know, do you have trouble meeting women? Take our course. It worked for Charles Manson. That didn't go over very well. So it was a hard book to write. I hope we gave it context. There's an awful lot of new material in it, and I've been very careful to try to document exactly where I got everything. I can't tell you any more about Nancy and Joanne. Part of our agreement is I would only use their first names. I wouldn't describe them physically, and I would not reveal the parts of the country they live in. But they were very brave and helpful and came forward. What I'd like to do, if you're willing, does anybody have any questions, anything that you wanted to ask? This is a good time, and hopefully I can answer.
You've written a book about the great gunfight.
Right, the last gunfight.
Right. You've also written a book about Bonnie and Clyde.
Yes.
Right now, what is it about certain people in society that just have these criminal minds? What do you think is possibly the cause of this? You started at a very young age. Is there a brain abnormality, or is there something that causes these people to be so violent?
With Manson, I was able to gain access to some of the testing that was done on him at the various prisons. He tested out with a slightly above normal IQ. He's not stupid, he's uneducated, but that doesn't mean stupid. I had not really given this much thought until writing this book, that it may be that there are some people, not many, thank God, but some, who from infancy almost, are incorrigible and violent and are not going to improve. We know now from Joanne particularly, but also Nancy, Manson's sister, that he was doing these things when he's 5, 6, 7 years old. He established a pattern that early that never changed. Some people have said, well, what do you think Charles Manson would do now? He's 78 years old if he were suddenly released. Well, I think he would do two things. First, I think he would audition for American Idol. He wanted to be a famous musician, and I don't think he's ever lost that. But somehow, some way, he would gain followers again, and he would again return to criminal activities. There are very few people who simply are that way. They're not going to change. I don't know if I believed that before I started writing this book, but I believe it now. Yes, sir.
You see the correlated between Manson and Hitler, because I read 2 days ago you make the comparison. Hitler was rejected as an artist, Manson was rejected as a musician.
A lot of people tend to equate Charles Manson with Adolf Hitler. I mean, they're both small men, both clearly had great rage, but Adolf Hitler was able to subvert and lead an entire nation. That was never going to happen with Charles Manson. Manson, at any given time, probably had 20 or 30 members of the family towards the end of his career. But he had trouble keeping a lot of them, and he was always bothered with defections. Manson sort of looked up to Hitler. He felt that the Nazis had it right. Manson was a tremendous racist. In prison, I'm told, he refused to even talk to black and Hispanic inmates, whites only. He had a pathological fear of the Black Panthers. He was convinced there was going to be a shooting war and the blacks were going to annihilate the whites. Just real quickly, this is on a tangent, but I'll get back to your question. Manson preached to his followers that there was going to be helter-skelter, a black-white race war, and Charlie and the family would go to the Mojave Desert, where they would hide during the war in a bottomless pit. And when the war was over, the blacks would win, but they were not bright enough to be able to actually govern themselves afterward. So Manson and his followers would emerge from the pit, and they would take over and, in fact, rule the world. Yeah. As Leslie Van Houten said to me, we were taking an awful lot of LSD by that time. And she didn't laugh when she said it either. Manson would have loved to be Hitler. He didn't have the capacity for that. His charisma was such that he could captivate a small audience, perhaps. But I think media exposure ultimately would have ruined him. In fact, during the trial, Manson had expected that Rolling Stone was going to write, just a lavish profile of him, worshiping him. And instead, they come out with the story about how nothing he says makes sense, and his followers are now trying to sell their interviews. So, no, Manson was no Hitler. But they both had thwarted dreams, and they both took their vengeance in terrible ways. Have any of you listened to much of Manson's music? I'm curious. I got to listen, because of Phil Kaufman, to some of the original tapes he made back with the Beach Boys and in Brian Wilson's recording studio. And they're not real good. There were some things overdubbed later. As Patricia Krenwinkel tells it, when they went into the studio, Manson had this thing that all women automatically knew how to do certain things. That women were put on this earth to serve men. But beyond that, when any of the women were pregnant, they had to have natural childbirth assisted by their fellow female members of the Manson family. And when the woman would say, we don't know, how to take care of a birth, and he would say, well, you're women, of course you know. When they were out in the desert starving, Charlie told the women they had to go out in the desert and find edible plants. When they said, I don't know anything about plants, he said, you're women. Women know how to do it. And he decided that all women had to be great backup singers. And so he brought the women from the family into the recording studio to do background vocals. And they were pretty awful singers, except for Gypsy, who was a very talented violinist. But they couldn't sing on key, and the caterwauling was horrible. And Charlie would stop in mid-song and scream at them to get in key, and they didn't know what the hell he was talking about. And it was just a terrible experience for them. So Manson never really had a chance to become a rock star. He thought he did, but that was never going to happen. Yes, Miss.
I think Manson had several children with women in the family, and I was wondering if you did any research into the children, or what they're doing now, or if they're in touch with his family.
Manson has had 3 children that we know of. One, his oldest son committed suicide a few years ago. The 2 others, of them, one has completely dropped out of sight, and while I was able to find his sister and his cousin, I couldn't find that child. Another one I did track down, but it was made clear to me that this was not something that this person wanted to talk about, and I respected that. I found some family members. I tracked almost all of them down. And as you can see from the book, a few did talk to me and were very cooperative. Most of the others wanted money to talk. Their current asking price is $25,000 an interview. But unfortunately, Simon & Schuster wouldn't up my advance to make this possible, so I had to regretfully tell them no. But there were a few that I found who didn't want to talk. They're trying to put all this behind them, and in at least 2 cases, their family, and we're talking now about spouse, children, and grandchildren, have no idea they were a couple of the people famously associated with Manson, and I think they have a right to that privacy. When I tracked down his sister and cousin, who had never, ever wanted to be found or interviewed, I didn't want to just knock on their door and say, "Hi, you've been dreading this moment for 44 years. I sent them registered letters saying, "Hi, I'm Jeff Guinn, I'm a writer, this is the book I'm trying to write. May I send you a couple of my books so you can see what kind of writer I am? And if you're willing to talk to me, I'll protect your identity. If you don't want to talk, I will never give your contact information out to anybody else." And so I talked to them on the phone a couple times, and then they each said, "Come out and we'll meet and talk about it," and then they ultimately agreed to cooperate. But I did feel I had to respect the rights of people not to talk to me if they didn't want to. So fortunately, we were able to talk to enough of them. We have a very good idea of things and a lot of surprises in the book. Yes, sir?
Regarding the use of psychedelics by Manson and the family, do you feel like that was part of the times that sort of exacerbated his own bad ideas, or something that he actually embraced and used to control?
Manson saw the drugs as a tool to keep people under control. Everyone remembers that when he would dole out the daily fixes on LSD, he would take a smaller dose than anybody else. Leslie Van Houten said that once everybody was dosed, then their job was to listen to Charlie preach, and if you didn't pay attention, he would get up and hit you. That sometimes he would actually crack people over the head with a chair. They always had to listen to the Beatles or Charlie. That was the music, though. He also liked Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild and some of the stuff of the Moody Blues. But Leslie Van Houten said they got so sick of Magical Mystery Tour over and over and over again. They had a school bus that they would tool around the country in, and Manson would always say, "See, we're doing what the Beatles want us to do. We're taking mystery tours." But he used the psychedelics as a tool, as a controlling device. They weren't the only thing he used. He used physical coercion. He certainly used sex. I was pretty embarrassed by some of the graphic things I had to put in the book, but this is what they all told me. The women were kept under particular control. They would go out and they would panhandle, and they also had some nice clothes. They would put on these clothes and go to grocery stores and say they were Girl Scout leaders, and they wanted donations for snacks. But the women were never allowed to have any money with them when they were out on the streets, not even a penny. And this is one of the controlling things pimps do with their prostitutes so that nobody can get on a bus and go away or have the wherewithal. If LSD hadn't been around at the time, he would have found something else. Manson was a great innovator in that way. Yes, ma'am.
You touched in the book, I haven't read it yet.
Y'all love it.
Do you touch on him getting cell phones while he's in solitary confinement at all?
I was really sorry that happened because I think I might have worn him down otherwise to get to go see him. Manson lost most of his visiting privileges on 3 occasions, 2 for unauthorized cell phones and 1 for carving a shank out of his toothbrush handle. Apparently somebody had made him unhappy and he was going to deal with it. Now, he's 78 years old, folks. Manson actually has a fairly comfortable life in prison. I was able to find a couple of his most recent cellmates, in fact, a couple that are still incarcerated who were kind enough to describe his day. He likes to work in the prison hobby shop, and if you will send him $1,000 for his ATWA program, he's an environmentalist. ATWA stands for Air, Trees, Water, and Animals. He says we have to protect. You might get yourself a little spider pin or something. If you're a big donor, you'll see there's a picture in the book. Charlie will actually draw you something. He likes spiders, swastikas, and the word helter-skelter. There's actually a guy in Dodge City, Kansas named Bob George who has a Manson shrine room. And he's the one that got Charlie to agree to let me use this painting. Manson is a vegetarian still. He's particularly fond of ramen noodles. He loves John Wayne movies. He has a favorite comedian, George Lopez. I know. He still composes songs and is hopeful that a recording contract is still in his future. But one of the things that I heard repeatedly from people who have been in prison with him since his incarceration is that every once in a while somebody comes up to him and said, "Charlie, what really happened with Tate LaBianca?" And they say, Manson always smiles and said, "I don't know anything about it," and then he gives a big wink. If I'd gotten to see him, I don't know that it would have done much good, by the way. He gathered the family before the arrests and said that if he was ever arrested again, he was going to put on his crazy Charlie act and convince everyone he was insane, so he'd be let off. And Patricia Krentwinkel and Leslie Van Houten both said the same thing. To this day, he's still putting on the crazy Charlie act. He's fooled us all. Maybe he has. It's so kind of you all to come out on a Tuesday night. I appreciate that. I'd be very happy to sign your books if you like. And there's one other thing I'd like to do while we're all here. If you like this book, if you read it, and you feel it's not only got a lot of good information in it, but that it's something you've enjoyed reading, there are 2 special people to thank for that. My editor from Simon & Schuster, Bob Bender, and the one and only Johanna Lee. With their help, I was able to write the kind of book that I hope to write, and a book that I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.